Alright, hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about openings, and in particular, the question of should I or should I not switch my current opening repertoire. And we're going to be mainly looking at this from the perspective of a player who of course wants to improve, because if you don't want to improve, it's like, go ahead, have fun, right? Switch your openings, play whatever bullcrap you want to play, you're not here to improve. But for the player who is looking to improve and asking this question to themselves, should I switch my current opening? I'm not so sure how I feel about it or not. This video is for you. We're going to be looking at four main factors to which will really determine whether or not you should change your opening. And so the first thing that we should be talking about if we're going to be talking about this topic of switching openings is rating. And in my opinion, if you're under like 1600, 1500 over the board, this isn't meant to be some like elitist thing or anything, I just don't think that you should really be switching openings. And a lot of the reasons why tie into other things we're going to discuss later, but basically like for one thing, but one of the major reasons is that if we take a look at this from the perspective of your results right now and what's most letting it down, it's probably just not the opening phase. And like, okay, as we're going to discuss next, like if you play some absolutely garbage opening, like you play 1G4 flight, you play the grub opening, then yeah, that's probably going to let down your results to some extent. But even like that level, like say you're 1200, 1300, you could probably even get away with that. Not that I recommend that, of course, just being clear, but once you sort of climb above this level of like say 1600 or so, the opening slowly starts to become more and more important as you climb that ladder, because say at like the 2200 level around where I'm at, and now I'm not just saying this as an excuse for me to be like, oh, I can switch openings a million times. Even for me, like there's a limit on how much I should be like jumping around from opening to opening, right? But like let's say the 2200 level, right? And this gets true even higher. Like this is a reason why like the very elite players, they spend all their time in the openings, because if you just put two like super GMs in like the most like dead equal position, it's like, if you gave two 1200s that same position, they'd probably somehow muck it up, they'd make some stupid blunders, and there'd be chances for both sides, right? Give two 2700 that same position, they're just gonna like easily make a draw. It's not even gonna be like anything of a fight. So for example, a player who is like playing the London system and they're like 2000, they're not really getting anything out of the opening, they could potentially see some improvement if they like started playing a more mainline opening, which would give them better chances for like an advantage out of the opening, because if they're playing players of their own level who are sort of just gain fine positions out of the opening, they sort of need that extra thing to really create the difference in their games, especially with the white pieces. But again, if you're in this sort of bracket here, anywhere within this point, openings just should not really be what you're thinking to. Like, okay, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, oh, openings don't matter at all, just do tactics, bro. But like, to some extent that is kind of true. If you're at this level, like I personally have to say, I didn't really touch openings much until I was already 1800 FIDE. It did help me get beyond that point, because my openings up until that point were complete dog shit. But you shouldn't really be placing too much of an emphasis on thinking that, oh, if I just change my opening, that's what's going to fix my results, because that probably couldn't be further from the truth if this is what the level you're at right now. But the second part I want to discuss here is how sound is the opening you're currently playing, because this plays a big role in whether you should switch or not. Like for example, with the black pieces, if you were playing like some really like this is an opening I used to play at one point when I was like 14 years old, I think. I played this opening called the Portuguese Gambit. I made a video last year called How to Refute the Portuguese Gambit. Long story short, it's not the best opening in the world, as you may imagine. It has sort of somewhat of a cult following here because it is a bit of a tricky line. But in all honesty, it's just not the best opening in the world. And after a string of sort of not so good results with it, I ultimately just ended up dropping it. And to be honest, this was an example of an opening which I don't think it was necessarily a bad idea to drop it. It probably wasn't favorable to my long-term development as a chess player. Playing this opening, it was sort of more or less kind of playing for tricks in my opinion. Although to be honest, at the level I was at the time, like 1800 FIDE or so, I probably could have milked a bit more out of it. I just sort of had some bad losses and then got really pissed off. And that is one thing you sort of need to look out for. It's like, don't think that just because you lose like one game with an opening that you should just immediately switch. That was to some extent what happened here. And while I don't necessarily think like playing this opening itself was necessarily bad, perhaps the reason as to why I switched at the time, like because I just got frustrated over some loss, that probably wasn't such a good attitude to have. And just to spit out some like other examples of openings, like which if you're playing anything like this, it's probably switch because you're just shooting yourself in the foot. This one like FM Online, he keeps playing this against me in Blitz. He is just like, if you look at our match like history, it's just like a streak of wins to me, because he keeps playing this kind of bullshit with Black, where he just plays this opening called the Fujara, which, if I haven't said that already, my short-term memory is suffering immensely, where Black basically banks on you going like after b6 here, queen d5, but then they sort of have some weird trap where they try to like trap your queen and some nonsense like this. And the problem is just after a move like a3 here, you just sort of ignore Black here, you don't go for any queen d5 nonsense, and you just sort of question Black, like, what the hell are you doing, mate? And the answer is not much. They're just sort of down a pawn here. And so the next thing I want to talk about, this is also very important here, it's how long have you been playing opening for? Or as I've indicated in this graph here, how many games have you played this opening in? So of course here the x-axis is sort of how many games, and then the y-axis, I've called it competence here on a scale of 100 to 0% here. I wasn't sure how else to quantify this. It's sort of a bit made up, but it's just sort of to, you know, illustration purposes here. And basically what I want to get across here is that the first like 10, 50 games or whatever you play in openings I show in this graph here, for most openings, as I've sort of illustrated in the graph here, you're going to have this initial sort of hump here where you're not going to feel like you're getting better at playing this opening. It's going to be quite frustrating, you're losing a lot of rating points, and you're going to be like, what's the point of all of this? Let me just switch openings again. And this part is definitely more geared towards, by the way, someone, just to be clear, someone who has already just more recently maybe changed openings in the last few months and haven't really quite gotten that grip yet on the opening they're playing. Or maybe like you've been playing the opening for a while and you're still sort of feeling frustrated. In my opinion, this graph sort of explains a lot of reasons why people are having the frustrations that are with maybe a new opening. It's they just haven't gotten in enough sort of reps yet with playing games and whatnot. Or another important aspect I haven't illustrated in this graph, and maybe is even more important, is how much study time have you put into this opening? Have you really put in that effort to understand it? Because if you haven't, like, I mean, you can't just complain and be like, oh, I don't understand the opening, because, well, you haven't tried. But essentially here, expect like the first 50 or so games just to be kind of a bit of a shit show. As I'll explain in the next part, it depends on the opening. Like some switches will be a lot easier than others, but don't just like get pissed off the moment you play a couple games, you lose some rating points and stuff, because whatever opening you learn, it's gonna take time to do so, because there's all sorts of like tactical motifs, all sorts of like variations that you just need to study, which at the very start you're just not going to have in your sort of arsenal. It takes time to really accumulate all this stuff and then translate it into actual results. And so as you see here, around this like 50 to 100 games kind of mark here, this is where you sort of, at least in my sort of head, this is where you sort of have these exponential results with this opening, and you start to become a lot more competent with it. Now this isn't going to look like your rating going up 200 rating points or something just after within this bracket, because there's of course more to just your results than the opening phase, but the opening alone, in my opinion, this is kind of true. And then sort of like as I've illustrated here, like once you get past like 100 games, again, that's just an arbitrary number. I'm just sort of trying to give you guys a rough sort of idea for how things may be here. Then the gains start to tail off a little bit. It becomes a lot more linear rather than like exponential. And you just sort of have to pick away at a lot of like small things in the opening, like all these small details, which is like, oh, I didn't know that thing existed. That's a nice small tactical idea, which is pretty rare. Okay, now I know that for next time. And generally also during this part, this is also sort of when like you're gonna feel pretty comfortable playing this opening. You'll feel pretty at home playing it. You're not gonna like play the opening and feel like, oh, what if my opponent like somehow like blasts me off the board within like 50 moves? You're probably, oh sorry, 50, that's kind of a bit long for opening, like 15 rather. You're not really gonna have that sort of fear anymore, at least in my experience. Maybe other people are different, but yeah, that's sort of how it's been for me. But also I should say, this graph implies that you're not just like playing blitz games and like repeatedly just like hopping in the pool. You're like actually looking at your games afterwards. You'll probably still get something out of them even if you don't analyze it, but it's not going to be nearly near as much as it could be if you took the time after every game you played in this opening to really make sure you understood what happened in the opening phase, where could you have improved, what opportunities did you miss. I've talked about this also in my video, I believe, why you should play blitz. Check that out if you haven't already. It should give a good overview of some of more of my philosophy regarding this topic. So basically, long story short, if you just started playing the opening in the last 2 months, you're not seeing the results you want to, stick it out a little bit more. Chances are you're in this sort of initial stage here, like the first 50 games or so where you just haven't really gotten enough volume yet. Your results aren't looking the way you want them to, but again, you're in this initial phase here. And so the last element we're going to be talking about in this video is going to be style. Again, as I was talking about earlier, like if you're under 1600, you're probably not going to want to like switch openings a whole lot. Another thing that a lot of kind of masters say, oh, your style is blunder. And I mean, if you're below that level, it's probably true to some extent, right? So again, it's style below a certain level doesn't really matter a whole lot, but again, as you sort of climb up a little bit, you start to develop things you like, things you don't like in the game. It is worth taking this into account when you choose your opening repertoire. For example, I've always played fairly solid. I should probably switch the board, honestly, flip it around. Against D4, I've always played fairly solid openings. I played a lot of like the QGD. The other main opening that I played is the Nimzo Indian, also a very solid opening here against the D4. So then like at one point when I switched to playing the King's Indian online, I think this is around 2021, I had a bit of a fling with the King's Indian online. My results honestly, like they were okay, but a lot of the times I just didn't really feel comfortable in these positions. And again, it could have been a factor of me just having not quite played enough games. I was still in like that first initial hump phase and I sort of might have given up too early. But it also might have had just something to do with the fact that inherently it didn't really suit my style. And yes, I believe style, once again, it is something that you can change to some degree. But you should also sort of point like where I was in my chess development, recognize your natural strengths and proclivities within the game. And for me, my natural strengths, although I can be good at playing sometimes these more like dynamic, aggressive positions, it's not sort of my natural strength as a player. My sort of strength is playing more technical, slow positional stuff, grinding people out in endgames. The King's Indian didn't really, like sometimes you do get those more technical sort of positions, but the nature of the opening definitely sort of tends toward the more dynamic side of things, which didn't really suit my overall style. And so within a certain amount of time, I eventually realized that, switched away from the King's Indian, started playing my normal stuff again. And that's just sort of one example of where style can sort of matter. Also in terms of, if you just want to like add an opening to your repertoire or switch in general, you also should understand that going from like say you play like the Queen's Gambit Declined, right? It's going to be a lot easier for you to start picking up an opening like the Slav Defense, which is like very solid, compared to something like the King's Indian, which is very inherently like different in the nature of the positions you get. Because once again, it's more dynamic. It's not like because in the Slav or the Queen's Gambit Declined, you often get these sort of positions, right? Where it's the difference between like the first and second best move is not that big, and it sort of gives you a lot more leeway. Whereas in the King's Indian, that because of the, space disadvantage that you incur in yourself very early on in the game, it often forces you to actually be a bit more precise here, meaning that if you're at sort of a semi-critical juncture of the game and you choose one slightly off move, it could be the difference between you having a playable position and you just suffering for all eternity for the rest of the game. And as someone who played these more solid openings like the QGD, the Nimzo, this was not something I was very accustomed to, and also wasn't something that I really liked, to be honest. Although, just to be clear, that's not to say the King's Indian is by any means a bad opening. One of the benefits of this opening is that compared to these more solid openings, very often you can, if your opponent's a little bit sort of inaccurate, it swings both ways, right? If they're a little bit inaccurate, compared to some of these more solid openings here, they might sort of be able to get away with that a little bit more. But in the King's Indian, at least from my experience, carelessness can sort of be a lot more punishable, which again is one benefit of playing this opening. But anyways, that is just about all I wanted to say about switching openings for this video. If you liked it, please like it, and also subscribe if you're not already. And also leave a comment down below if there's anything that you want to say. But with that being said, I hope you guys all have a good day, and I will see you until next time.